you've all been dying to hear about, so let's get there and talk about it. So, let me pull up. There's a table of these forms that you saw earlier. And just by way of reference, I put together a table of these as well. These are some examples. They're not exhaustive. I just thought I'd pull out some. I'm going to talk about these particular figures and what we call figures and moods in Aristotle. Hegel pretty much drops the figure mood thing. He doesn't care about those because that's not really relevant, because this is all about a term logic that's about the terms, and the terms are universality, particularity, and singularity. So the figure mood thing really doesn't matter so much to him, because that introduces, on his view, reintroduces a subjective dimension. So I'll still talk about the first figure just as a useful way of talking about it, but it really is, Hegel doesn't spend any time talking about figure mood. His point, much like with the judgment forms, is twofold. Right? When we're looking at the syllogisms, here's what we need to think about. And the first one will be no surprise, right? You'll go, I could have seen that coming. And that is, universality has to be rethought, right? Universality can't be as we stand and think. So there's that point, again, that we've already seen in the judgment forms about the nature of universality. It has to be thought of ultimately as a genus that particularizes or specifies itself. And that's what the disjunctive syllogism form is ultimately going to do. Right? That's what it's about. Right? So that's why there's only 3 syllogism forms as opposed to the 4 judgment forms. We can argue and talk more about that, but that's the reason. The second thing he wants to say is that, and this we might not have seen coming, but it's already here on the page when he's talking about the fulfilled copula, is that the point of syllogisms is obviously not about predication. That's what judgment forms are about. They're about predication. It's about inference, right? It's about inference. But what's the inference really all about? Well, it's about thinking the middle term. It's about thinking the middle term. So what is the middle term? Das Mitte, as he says, right? How do you pass through this and it connects the major and the minor terms to one another? That's pivotal. And strangely, or maybe not so strangely enough, we'll get there in just a little bit to talk about this. He's going to argue that the final syllogistic form, the pinnacle of all the syllogistic forms, the disjunctive syllogism, is where universality is the middle term. Strangely, you might have thought it was going to be particularity, right? All the stuff in the judgment forms about the copula are really about, well, particularization is what, combines, links, connects the predication together, right? It's what takes singularity has this particularity, because it has that particularity, and universality is particularized in this way. Particularity is where they meet. So if you're thinking about the judgment forms, you could easily say predication is about particularization. Because it's how the universal gets particularized, and therefore the singular fits with it because it's particularized in a certain way. And that's the necessity of that relationship, that the conforming of one to the other. That's really what the apodictic judgment form really tells us. So particularity is the heart and soul of predication. Right? The particular, so much like the concept, right? Although we're constantly rethinking the universal, to get to that, it really still is particularity that takes, at the end of the day, center stage still. But what we learned here is that the middle term does, in the syllogism, function like, it's not the same thing, functions like the copula does in a judgment. So the middle term in a syllogism functionally plays the role of the copula in a judgment. The middle term in a syllogism, I should say, plays the role of the middle of the copula in the judgment. And here, the middle term will ultimately prove to have to be universality itself. All right. So if, as Hegel has argued, the disjunctive and apodictic judgment forms are defined by concrete or objective universality, why then must the syllogistic forms be minimally defined and thus begin from a form that relates or concludes, infers abstract universality to or from abstract singularity through abstract particularity? Why do we go back to that? I mean, if we've already gotten to substantive, concrete, objective universality, why do the syllogistic forms start back with, kind of reinvent the wheel again and go back through this process of, okay, we're going to start back with inherent universality, then subsumptive universality. Why does it go back to play through that same route? So why do we start with a form that's indifferent to these two moments, right? Why don't we already start from objective universality where we've got this connection, generation already on the table? So both the subject and predicate positions in the apodictic judgment form contain singularity and universality. each of which inherently contains particularity that in turn unites them. That's the claim we saw out of apodictic judgment. Yet they each lack an immediate intermediary that in fact joins them with this particularity, the singular with its particularity and the universal with its particularity. In apodictic judgment, the singular and the universal thus attain a mediated identity, but it is an identity that rests upon a subject that is defined by an immediate identity of singular and particular, and a predicate that is defined by an equally immediate identity of universal and particular. The result then is not a judgment as such, as we've seen, but a syllogism that links the singular with the universal. That's the conclusion that it reaches, necessarily then. Via two more basic judgments, the singular is the particular in the subject, the major premise, and this universal is the particular, the predicate, which is the minor premise. So the immediacy of the relations in each of the judgments that make up the subject and the predicate positions means that the determinations of the concept, the universal particular singularity, at this juncture are indifferent to their connections to one another. So remember, that final apodictic judgment form is the result of an inference. So Hegel's saying, right, it's the result, it's the conclusion, it's what you've concluded to, it's what you've inferred to. But what you've got to start again with, from the syllogistic side, is, well, how did you get the major premise, the minor premise, and then get the conclusion? Don't take the conclusion. This is kind of like, I'm sure, whenever you're grading your undergraduate papers, right, they love to give you the conclusion. And you say, excuse me, give me the argument for the conclusion, right? This is Hegel's version of that in a certain kind of way, right? He's saying, you reach the conclusion here, right? And you think, oh, eureka, we're there. And he says, well, remember, you had to get the subject as the predicate first, right? And the subject is the predicate only as far as the singular is the particular and the predicate is the universal is the particular. Well, what are those connections? So the immediacy of the relations in each of the judgments that make up the subject and make up the predicate positions means that the determinations of the concept at this juncture are indifferent to their connection to one another. And thus each is abstract. As such, they bear an inferential relation that is qualitative. That's why we start over. Right? That's why we're beginning, it looks like from the beginning again, from qualitative to quantitative to concept. It's a syllogism, it's an inference, but it's comprised of qualitative judgment. It's a syllogistic relation of existence. So we start with a syllogism of existence. So we've got to go back and figure out how the major premise operates in relation to the minor premise relates to the conclusion. We had the conclusion, now we need to back up and get the major and minor premise and see how that works with the conclusion. So the syllogism of existence, qualitative syllogisms, he says, unite the immediately given abstract singular with the abstract universal through an immediately given particularity. So you have the abstract singular is the abstract particular. S is P, right? S relates to the P. That's the major premise. The minor premise, the abstract particular is the abstract universal. That's the P is the U. So then you can put the all three together. The abstract singular is the abstract universal by virtue of what? The P, right? The middle term. So particularity is the middle term. Just like we saw with the apodictic judgment. That's what particularity was. It was the middle term. So the singular is joined here. That's the first figure, the SPU, right? That's the first figure. You get up there under Dawson at equality. The singular is joined to the universal through, by means of, the particular. But it is so in a way that is wholly contingent or accidental. This is because the singular has determinations that have nothing to do with the particularity that joins it to the universal. It has a lot of other features, this house. Not only does it have these particular features that make it good, it has a lot of other features that are irrelevant to that or make it bad or whatever. And the particularity is connected to a number of universals, right? A number of universals has those features in it. Not exclusively the one in question. And the universal is also not exclusively tied to the particular or the singular. So we don't have a tight bond. We have a loose affiliation between those three moments. But together they can infer a necessary relation, which is what you get in the apodictic judgment, but we're not there in the major and the minor premise. Hence, the universal is actually tied to the particular by way of the singular. That's the second figure. So the particularity is tied to universality through, the middle term comes second, singularity. So the qualitative syllogistic forms are thus syllogisms of inherence, because the universal inheres in the singular. The universal inheres in the singular. And as such, the universal is joined by virtue of that to particularity. So that's what you're getting here, is the universal inheres in the singular, because the particular also inheres in the singular binds the two together. That's how you get back to SUP now, Universal is what binds them two together. So you'll say, well, look, there's the universal, it's the middle term. We're good. Third figure of the first form of the syllogism, right? Not how it works, because the universality there is inhering in both. It's not been determined in that both. So the link between the particular and the singular actually operates by way of the universal that they share. The universal inheres in the singular as its particularity. It's what it bears with it. So SUP, the first figure. Now, insofar as the universal, the particular, and the singular each occupy the positions of the extremes, notice in each one of those figures you could say, well, at one point or another, each one of those determinations is major or minor extreme. And the medius terminus, the middle term, the determinations are actually no longer distinguished from one another by their role in the inferential relation. That's why he says you can all be equivalent to one another. They're all the same. There's the fourth figure. A lot of arguments about why there's a fourth figure in the first one. It basically boils down to the fact that they're indiscriminate. They're all playing the same role. They're all playing the same function. So it's universal, universal, universal. Hence, Hegel's basic claim about the qualitative or inherent form of inferential relations is that the third figure, SUP, actually requires the first, SPU, and the second, PSU, because the first establishes the relation of singular to universal, S is universal, singular is universal, and the second establishes the relation between universality and particularity, particularity is universal, that comprise the major and minor premises, respectively, from which the third figure infers the relation of the singular in relation to the particular. In that way, the syllogistic forms of existence show the nature of mediation at issue here is to be transformed imminently and necessarily. Instead of each termination being indifferent to the others, in a word, abstract or immediate, the three figures of the syllogisms of existence have shown that particularity mediates the singular and the universal, and the particularity is itself mediated by each of them. Now, that necessitates the move from syllogisms of inherence to syllogisms of subsumption. Because for the determination to be mediated in that way, is for the universal not to inhere in the singular, but the singular to be subsumed in and thus be a member of the universal by way of the particular. So that same move he made in the judgment forms now recurs, right? It's repeated, although now we're talking about major and minor premises, major and minor terms, and middle terms. That same move from inherence to subsumption takes place here. So it's by way of particularity. So particularity is the key middle term at this point. Universality is thought here now as, in the syllogisms of reflection, as a class concept. Membership and subsumption. Now look at what he does with the syllogisms of reflection. The syllogism of reflection, what he also calls the quantitative syllogism, like he calls the judgments of reflection, quantitative judgment. It's fundamentally about the nature of class membership. The singular is united with the universal through a particular that is mediated by a universal that is mediated by a singular. They're all circular in that sense. They're members of one another. The singular is united to the universal as a member of a class. The class is what universality is. So the key feature of these syllogistic forms is that the relation of the singular to the universal, universal to the singular, is a matter of contingency, extrinsic combination. Hegel always, has this moment where he says, look, subsumption, like inherence, is a real thing. Ontologically real out there in the world. So when we do abstraction, when we say things inhere in other things and that's all they are, that's real. That's out there in the world. There's real ontological ground for those declarations. We're not always telling lies when we're saying, well, this thing is, an instance of this general thing. Yeah, that's right. That's out there. That's in the world. Subsumption works right. So you can do, as he says, the syllogism of analogy or induction here. Got all these various kinds of syllogisms here. The syllogism of allness means you just subsume under universality. Right? They all belongs underneath universality. The singular through particularity is subsumed under universality. But you can also do induction. You can start with a particular and say, oh, well, that gives me a singular, and the singular then is a member of this universal class, so it is inductive, like we've abstracted out of particularity to a singular, and then say the singular is an instance of a generality we can generate out of it. And then you can do analogy. You can say, well, one singular is like another, similar in terms of their universal property, their universal class they're members to, I should say, and that gives you particularity. Here's you can define what their particularity is. When you're doing that analogical inference note, you're no longer simply working subsumptively. You are and you aren't. The analogical mode of argumentation, the analogical syllogistic form, is at once both a subsumptive logic and not a subsumptive logic. So, yeah, I did it for induction. I wish I'd done it for analogy. I didn't. I apologize. The universal in an analogical syllogism is here already objective and concrete. It's no longer just a class. How do we know that? Because its singulars are now necessarily joined to it because they are its determinations and its specifications. Otherwise, the analogies don't work. Right? The particularizations, right, the particulars that you're going to point to, the singulars that you're going to point to, and have these particularities about them, if they're not really belonging to that class, then the analogies don't work. One thing's like another doesn't work unless one thing belongs to a class, then another thing belongs to a different class, and you can draw the similarities between them and the distinctions between them. So the singulars have got to be its, that is the universal determinations, its specification. The universal then is a genus, not a class anymore. And it's dividing or particularizing itself into these species, which are being compared to one another, being now analogically compared to one another, rather than the class contingently subsuming singulars possessed of certain particularities. So there's Hegel's move from syllogisms of reflection, which are fundamentally about subsumption, allness and induction, clearly about subsumption. But the analogy is subsumptive in the sense that, well, it's about how the singular belongs to this class, but it belongs to that class because it's a determination of the class. And that means it's no longer a class concept, no longer a class way of thinking about universality. It's a specification way, a determination way of thinking about universality. Because without that determination, without that specification of universality, rather than mere subsumption, you don't really have the basis for analogy. One thing is like another seems like an empirical, assertion that's based in nothing other than noticing, well, this thing has similar properties to that thing, or it has different properties than that thing. But it has to be rooted in something deeper than that, namely that both of them are specifications of the universality that you're trying to access when you note those features. So that pushes you into the syllogisms of necessity. And Hegel here, the issue here is the same as it was with the judgments of necessity and judgments of concept. Particularization and the modal status of that particularization. Same thing here. What Hegel does here is he combines the question about apodeicticity and the question about the disjunctive nature into one judgment form. So the modality question, which was in the judgments of the concept, fourth form of the judgment, here is in the third syllogistic form, the judgment of necessity itself. So how did these work? Well, the syllogism of necessity, the relational syllogism, we also call it, qualitative, quantitative, relational syllogism, unites the singular with the particular through a universal. Listen to that again, because that's a weird claim. It unites the singular with the particular, not the singular with the universal. That we're familiar with, right? Singular united with the particular singular united with the universal through the particular, very common. How do we know this table is a member of the class table? Because it has the particular features that all tables have insofar as they need to be tables. There, we singular united it with the universal table. How do we do it? Through its particular features that it shares with other things. So that's our common way of doing it. But in the syllogism of necessity, the relations of the singular with the particular through the universal. Because the universal is both what the particular is and what the singular is. It, remember, is the genus that specifies itself, so there's the particularity, various species. And the singulars are members that are said they're embodiments of, completions of, that specification. So that's how they're all joined together through now universality. Universality is not, so to speak, the mediator by way of which you get from singularity to universality. It's the way you get from singularity to particularity. Why does this thing have these specific features? Because universality is specified itself. So it's through a universal that is now a genus. That's what's doing the work. The genus is doing the work, rather than a class. And as such, a universal that is objectively and necessarily bound to the particular, the species, determined by the universal, that is, this universal self-differentiating itself as a genus, specifying itself, particularizing itself. Here, the genus, universality, is what it is only in its exhaustive particularization. That we learned to call back in the concept chapter, its principal totality. Its principal totality. It fully and completely and exhaustively particularizes itself. It necessarily does. And thus, the mediation of the singular with the universal is what it is only and through its. This is a way of trying to account for what Hegel's talking about here. So it's not terribly good English, but it'll say what I need to say. So the universal is what it is only and through its disjunctivity, that it others itself. That's what I mean by disjunctivity. It disjoins itself. It others itself. It particularizes itself. To be singular is thus now to be wholly and utterly a particularization posited, that is, determined or specified by universality by virtue of its own, universality's own inherent negativity. So you can say then, this is what we're about to see in the disjunctive syllogism, this is how they work, how they operate. If one singularized species exists, then the universal does not exist in this singular as the other species. It exists there only as that species. It can't exist as any other species. That's the either or, the both and way of thinking. So take a look with me on 622. This is the disjunctive syllogism. And there's a confession to be made here, and that's this. I'm probably the only person in the world that's excited about disjunctive syllogism. Right? So please, I apologize for what's about to happen. Right? But I'm convinced by Hegel, he may be wrong. Okay? Let's always acknowledge that. But I'm convinced that Hegel thought that the disjunctive syllogism, if you buy what he said, right? If you buy it all what he said, that the concept is the truth of being in essence, the large claim of the logic, and that the highest form of understanding what the structure of this process known as the concept is syllogisms, and the highest form of syllogism is disjunctive syllogism, then the process of the concept and its formal determination is best exhibited, best captured by, best accounted in terms of the disjunctive syllogism. So if you don't get how this operates, you don't know how the concept operates. That's my excitement. So whether or not it's warranted and merited, we'll see. I don't think you'll run out all excited about disjunctive syllogisms, but you might find them at least worthy of some further investigation. That's the lowering of the bar right that I'm trying to go for. So he says on 622 that the basic structure, this is 622 over 623 obviously, but 622, he says there that the middle term, right, this is under this the disjunctive syllogism, he says, as the hypothetical syllogism comes in general under the schema of the second figure of the formal syllogism, USP. So the disjunctive comes under the schema of the third, SUP. And at that point you say, well, okay, if it's SUP, then we're really just back up here at the third figure, we're back here at analogy. What have we really gained? No big deal. Well, of course, when we return to this figure, it's not the same as it was in analogy or the same as it was back in the third figure of the first syllogistic form. So he says the middle term, however, in a universe is a universality replete, filled, effulta, that language again he's coming back to, right? He's already put it in place. What do we mean by the fulfilled copula? What do we mean by the fulfilled middle term? Here it is. It's pregnant, way of translating it, with form. That's interesting, right? He doesn't say it's pregnant with materiality. It's pregnant with form. That's right, it's generating determinations. It's not generating things, this level, it's generating the determinations of from which things flow, but it's at this very abstract level. He says, it has determined itself as totality. There's that pulling back that notion again that we saw introduced in particularity in discussion of concept. This is a principle totality. He tells you that because he says it has determined itself as totality, as developed objective universality. All right, so what he's telling you is that, look, universality is the middle term here. It connects singularity with particularity. Those are the major and minor terms. They're going to be mediated through the middle term, and that's how this, this argument form that you see down here, the third form, major, minor premise, and conclusion, are going to operate. But he wants to stop for just a moment and say, but when we get to universality this time, it's not the same as it was the first time. Right? It's not inherence. It's not class. Well, what is it? He tells you. As that universality, so as objective universality, it is in the first place the substantial identity of the genus, but this identity is secondly one in which particularity is included. So he knows when you hear genus, you think, oh, the covering concept. It's like really class, it's a membership thing. No, it's replete, pregnant with form, right? It engenders its own specification. It's not like your standard, genera species relations like from whatever your favorite Porphyrian tree is, or Aristotle's version of that way back. So he endorses the genus, but is already telling you this isn't Aristotelian version of the genus. It says, but again, included as equal to it, therefore as a universal sphere that contains its total particularity. There's that totalization, right? Complete, principled totalization. The genus sorted out in its species. I love that, because that means there is no genus above and beyond the species. It is just its differentiations. Now, we've heard this language before, right? It's already in the concept, right? Universality just is particularization, that's all it is. But here now we've had them separated out, we've had them distinguished from one another. Now we're seeing it play this role, universality now, not particularization so much. Universality is already itself defined wholly and completely by its determination as particularity. It's particularizing itself, differentiating, or othering itself, disjuncting itself, as we're about to say, or differentiating itself, particularizing itself. So then he says, as a universal sphere that contains its total particularity, the genus sorted out in species, and A, which is B, as well as C and D. Now this is how he thinks disjunctive syllogisms work, right? It's this and this and this. The universal just is this proliferation of differentiation. Exhaustively, right? There's a principal differentiation going on, but it's exhaustive in this. So he'll say it's A, which is B, as well as C and D. But particularization is differentiation, and as such, equally the either or, if there's the either or operator now coming back, as we've seen before, of B, C, and D, negative unity. The reciprocal exclusion of the determination. So he'll say, look, what this means is that disjunction means it has an exclusive meaning, but, turn it around, this excluding, moreover, is now not just reciprocal, the determination not merely relative, but is also just as much self-relating determination, the particular as singularity to the exclusion of the others. So he goes ahead and gives you an example of this, right? He walks this through formally. A is either B or C or D. So there's this singular, which is a universal, right? Has these features, is this particularization. But A is B. So this particular is this universal, right? The universal has this particularization about it. So it's one of them. So what does that do? It excludes all the others. So you can say, well, therefore A is neither C nor D. There's a disjunctive syllogism. The either or allows you to say it's not the others. If it's one of them, it's not the other. But you can flip that. Look at what he says. A is, this top of 623. A is either B or C or D. But A is neither C nor D. Therefore, A is B. So you can exclude the others, and here's what you get. Now, a subject is not only, the next paragraph down, a subject is not only in the two premises, but also in the conclusion. It is a universal in the first premise, and in its predicate, the universal sphere, particularized in the totality of its species. In the second premise, so now we've gone from the major to the minor premise, it is a determinate, or as a species. But it's neither C nor D, that example. In the conclusion, it is posited as the excluding singular determinants, or again, in the minor, it is already exclusive singularity, and in the conclusion, it is positively posited as the determinant that it is. So we'll come back and look at an example of this, but Hegel's point here is fairly straightforward. disjunctive syllogisms work because the universal is the middle term, and the middle term only allows the disjunctive syllogism to work. The either-or function only operates if the universality in question here particularizes itself exhaustively into totality, and it's nothing over and above them. If it is just that particularization, if it disjuncts itself, right, differentiates itself into these various specifications, these various particular species, then and only then can you draw the conclusion that when you don't have one, when you have one, you don't have the others. If you don't have any of the others, then you have the one. It's only because of that principle of totality that when you exclude the others, that you can say, well, it's this one then. Or when you have all the others and you have one of them, you can say, well, it's none of the others then. That's how those two judgment forms, not judgment forms, syllogistic forms, inferential forms operate. So the example I use is this one. Humanity is either animal, vegetable, or mineral. Humanity is universality, particularities of totality of the species. But humanity is neither vegetable nor mineral, so there's the exclusion moment, right? So it's not one of these. Therefore, humanity is animal. The only way that works is if humanity is exhaustively particularized in terms of either animal, vegetable, or mineral. That's the only way in which that minor premise can do what it does. But if humanity is neither vegetable nor mineral, then there's only one option left. Now, if it wasn't principle totality of differentiation, you couldn't conclude, oh, well, then it has to be animal. Because that first premise might just be, well, here's some examples of what it could be. You know, it could be this, could be that, could be the other thing. I don't know. Infinity, right? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But if that were the case, then you couldn't, the minor premise wouldn't do you any work. It would just say, well, it's not one of those. And you go, good, that tells us which one it is. It's not two of those, doesn't tell you which one it is. But when it excludes the others, negates the others, it does precisely that. It gets you the conclusion precisely that way. So the logic of disjunctive syllogisms hinges upon universality being the middle term. It's what connects singularity and particularity, and it connects them because it differentiates itself completely and totally in a principled, necessary way. Now, we just run through it in what we call the exclusive mode. It's neither this nor that. Hegel also claims that it works inclusively as well, that exhaustive differentiation of universality allows you not only to exclude others and infer things from that, but it also allows you to include others and infer things in that structure as well. So if the universal is A or B or C as well, that's the inclusive sense of it. Then you can also talk about the exclusive sense of it, right? As we've been talking about it. It's individuated, it's either this one or that one or this one. Then the former inclusive sense is what the concrete universal is. It is what both the descending of the universal into the particular, as he called it back in chapter 1 in the concept, the descending of the universal into the particular, and the particularization of the genus into the species, that's what the disjunctive copula, which is what he called it in the chapter 2 on judgment, we're both trying to think, but we're ultimately unable to do so because neither one was able to conceive of the particular and the individual, the singular, as articulated, yet included within the universal at the same time. The latter exclusive sense is thus the real key to how the disjunctive syllogism works, as we've seen. If each particular species relates to itself and thereby becomes individual by excluding all other particular species, then if one particular species is asserted in the minor premise, then the others can validly be rejected and excluded in the conclusion. A is either B or C or D, but A is B, therefore A is neither C or D. You can exclude the others. If some particular species are excluded in the minor premise, then the rest can be asserted in the conclusion. A is either B or C or D, but A is neither C nor D, therefore A has got to be B. That's all that's left over. That's the example. So the moments of the movement of the concept are captured here in the very structure of that inferential process. In the major premise, you get the universal is the comprehensive, complete totality of diverse, differentiated, particular species. That's what you're getting in both, right? That's the major premise. In the minor premise, and this flows into the conclusion, in the minor premise, then you either get the singular is identified, which leads to its particular differentiation for the others, but it is this, so it can't be the others. Or you get the individuals differentiated from the other species, which leads to the assertion of the singular itself. But it's not this, it's not that, therefore it has to be the other. Which is the example I've used. So the inferential process both singularizes and particularizes, and the reason it is able to do this is because the universality within which it moves, the mediating middle, is a genuinely concrete, comprehensive totality. So if everything that exists, everything that's rational, is everything that exists, and if everything that exists is rational and it's rational, its rationality means that it's syllogism. And I think that claim you can take one step further, of course, here and say that means everything is a disjunctive syllogism. Can you do inductive syllogisms with them? Of course you can. Can you do analogies with them? Of course you can. Those valid ways of reasoning about the world? Of course you can. Why? Because it's there. It's there to be done. You can think of universality as a class concept. You can think about universality as an inherent model of a feature that's possessed by various different things. So you can do the syllogisms of existence, of Dasein. And the particularity is where the real key is. But that's all predicated on the truth of universality being the middle term and differentiating itself, the disjunctive syllogism. So when he says that the rational is the actual and the actual is the rational, and he says the rational is ultimately in the form of syllogism, disjunctive syllogism is what it means. That's ultimately what it means, because it is universality particularizing itself into individuality. By virtue of that, and only by virtue of that, can you reason with this? And this structure is available to us in the nature of reality itself. Pretty preposterous, right? I try to make as good a case as I can make for it, why it's here and we're about to do something really preposterous, but this is really, this is already pretty preposterous at this level. Questions about it, comments? I mean, come on, right? It's kind of anticlimactic in a certain way. You thought, oh, syllogisms, right? Now we're going to get it. And the syllogisms it gives it to you is, well, either this or that or this, not this, so therefore that. And that's the disjunctive syllogism, right? In a nutshell. It's either this, that, or the other thing. It's not those things, so it's this thing. It's this thing, so it's not those things. But underlying that, undergirding that very simplistic form of reasoning, is a notion that says, is the idea that says this, that the first premise, the major premise, that says universality is particularized in these various ways, is to assert that universality has inherent within it a complete totality of particularization. And only because of that, because that's a principle of totality, not an empirical totality. Notice there again, you would say, well, it could be one more. It's not these and it could be another one, but we don't know what the other one is because, consumers haven't demanded that flower be produced. But here, it's exhaustive totalization of particularity. Then and only because of that can you say, there is these other things, well then it can't be this one. Or it's not this thing, or it is this thing, so it can't be these others. Because the necessity of differentiation guarantees the inference from the minor premise, whichever way it's stated, to the conclusion. And dictates what the conclusion to be, but it's what makes possible the inference to work. Hegel's point then is that, that's a simple form of reasoning, yes, when we talk about the subjective side of it, simple form of reasoning, but it's profound in terms of its ontological structure it's built upon. It means that out there in the world, not in our heads, not in our abstractions, not in our tables, the Porphyrian trees that we build, none of that, that's not where genuses exist. Genuses are, to put it dramatically, real. The genus, known as the concept, is real. It's out there. And it generates itself, differentiates itself. We don't have to do that to it. That's not an operation of thought that is inflicted upon universality. It's something universality does to itself. And because it does that to itself, and only because it does it to itself, can we do all the kinds of inferential relations, inferential arguments that we've just looked at. Make some sense? Questions? Comments? Yes.
Could we just maybe review transition between the judgments to the syllogisms one more time? So why exactly do we have to essentially backtrack and like repeat the logic?
Why do we start over again with existence? Yeah. So the idea there is that, look, we're already through the conclusion, right? The conclusion is that you have this apodictic judgment that S is necessarily P, so we're done, right? We're to concrete universality. And Hegel will say, you're absolutely right, we're there. We're at concrete universality, no doubt about it. But we're only there by virtue of this underlying set of premises that are buried in the subject, buried in the predicate, that generate the judgment form out of them. And we've got to disinter them, right? We've got to disembed them. We've got to pull them out. And that's why you have to start with the first figure, because the first figure is really the way you get the subject of an apodictic judgment, the subject place, position, you get it formed. And then you have to go to the predicate position and get it formed and see that this other comes as the result of those major minor premises working in that way. So that's the reason why you have to, so to speak, as you well put it, right, start over again. But you start over again not in the simple sense of, oh, now we're going back to just judgment form. Now we're going back to the judgment forms as they operate in relationship to one another, right? Which is embedded, but not yet posited, right? It's implicit, not yet explicit, to use it that way, in the judgment form of the apodictic judgment. Does that help? The other thing to say there is that the apodictic judgment form, as I said earlier, is already a syllogism. It's just an implicit syllogism. Yes? And so what's happening with the syllogistic form analysis is you're unbearing the syllogistic form that's already there and examining its own terms without going, this is my little joke about not just rushing to the conclusion. It's apodictically the case, right? That's getting you all already back to the disjunctive syllogism. But looking at it step by step. Hegel demands patience, thoroughness, rigor, right? So just when you think, we don't need to go down that, oh crap, we do need to go down it because we actually haven't seen how that demonstrates itself. You know, there's a short step here, right? We could have stepped through this and made the way over with a shortcut. And Hegel says, no shortcut. I see it, I got you, I understand it. But that what was implicit has to be rendered explicit and worked through on its own terms, or we haven't done justice to the syllogistic forms themselves. We haven't shown how one entails the next entails. Does that help with that, Chris? Yeah. No, I think that's a really important point. It's worth restating anytime you do. Because it's one thing to say, well, he talks about it in terms of concept, judgment, and syllogism, great, but he also wants to claim that concepts entail judgments entail syllogisms. That's the harder claim to really parse out. But for Hegel, that's the more important claim, ultimately. Because anything less than that, and you've assumed formal logic, presupposed it, dogmatic presupposition, like he thinks Kant did, rather than actually demonstrated its warrant to be what he's claiming it is. Is that useful? Good, excellent. Comments, questions about this? All big fans of this disjunctive syllogism. I'm trying to get people to be fans, but not so much. Yes,
I don't know if this question is going to be formulated very well, so I apologize. And what I'm thinking about right now, I'm worried it'll come off as a question that's a critique at totalization, but it's not that.
I got it. Yeah, let's go.
So I'm trying to square this account of differentiation, at least within the disjunctive syllogism, as a complete exhaustibility of the a universal completely exhausting itself in its particularization.
Yeah.
So
it's not just an empirical totality.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
And squaring that with the account that we get of actuality and necessity.
Yeah.
In the doctrine of essence.
Yeah.
So where there any real possibility has to necessarily be actual.
Yes.
Do I have that right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So I guess my concern is, in terms of totalization, that there's nothing that could possibly be other for Hegel. Otherwise, it already would be, to use the Aristotelian question, actualized. It would be real. So is there an account of a possible set of affairs that isn't necessarily at one point going to become real in a concrete?
No, I appreciate this question. And I grappled with this for a long, long time trying to think through this. The way I've thought through it, I don't know if this language speaks to what you're saying, but I think it's the same issue, right? I'm sorry for this, maybe it doesn't work. is there a possible worlds theory in Hegel? Right? Could there be, Leibniz is famous for this, right? In the monadology? No, in Principles of Nature, I always forget what. In the theology, it's in the Theodicy, where Leibniz famously says, look, God before the creation of the world had all these possible worlds he could have created. I'm butchering this, right? So please don't go to Theodicy and go, oh, where is that? But the basic idea is that God had all these worlds that God could have created before the foundations of the world, right before the creation of the world. And he created the best of all possible worlds, right? This is the possible world thing. And he did this one because it was the best, and so we ought to think about things in terms of God's. It's really, the Theodicy is really saying that God had a moral and aesthetic appreciation for this world over above others, and that's the way we ought to judge it. That's Leibniz's Theodicy for why there's evil and suffering in the world, but because it's the best world possible. Not because it's the world that doesn't have any suffering, but because the world with suffering is the better possible world. Now, I don't care if you buy that or not, but it does introduce this notion of other possible worlds that were not actualized. And this goes to your point about, isn't it the case in Hegel that there is no possibility that couldn't be, that it doesn't ultimately have to be actualized? And so here's where I'm at with that. And I confess that I'm not as far as I'd like to be with it. So what you're about to hear is a fairly vapid answer to a really difficult question. I think it's the case for Hegel that in principle what you're saying is absolutely correct. I don't think there's anything wrong with what you're saying. That Hegel doesn't think that there's unactualized possibilities at the ontological level. Now, in space-time, that's another matter. Okay, so, but I don't want to cop out. I want to stay at the ontological level for Hegel, right? So, space-time, we can talk about unrealized possibilities. But at this level, no unrealized possibilities. And if that's the case, then differentiation has got to be the realization of all of those possibilities. It's got to be the particularization of universality into individuality, into singularity, and as I say, into actualization, to actuality, in the language of objective logic. And so an exhaustive totality would be the full and complete specification, particularization, totalization of that differentiation. I think that's what's undergirding the claim that there is no pure possibility in the objective logic. So I think for Hegel at the ontological level, there are no possible worlds. And we can talk about possible worlds at other levels, but that's not the issue. So there are no possible worlds. So he doesn't fall into the Leibnizian moment of saying, well, before God created the world, you have these options, or there are other options still out there that could realize. No, the one that we have is the one that is real. But the question is, at this point, what does it mean for it to be actualized? And here's where I think I come up fairly rapid with an answer, honestly. So I'd love to hear what you guys, if you have thoughts about this. Is that differentiation does entail actualization. But actualization isn't always done. That it's a process that's ongoing. As we encounter it, certainly, experience is spatiotemporal. But conceptually, the exhaustion of differentiation, the principled exhaustion of differentiation, I don't see anything in Hegel's account that tells me when it's done, other than it comes back to itself. Right? It's what he says about individuality, right? That the concept returns to itself in the moment of individuality. So that would be principled totalization, principled differentiation, principled particularization. But the principle of closure of that totality doesn't seem to me to be articulated other than this completion. And that completion is just nothing other than when it's completely and fully exhausted its differentiation. And I don't know the measure of that. I don't see Hegel articulating the measure of that. Now you're not saying this. I'm not going to accuse you of saying this, but there is an answer for that, right? You can say, oh, well, when he's done, it's done when it's, an identity. When it's all subsumable. Under totality, right? As a under universality. So it's all difference subsumed under totality. I just don't see any of that in Hegel, right? I get that that's a way of answering the problem. I absolutely get that that's a way, and you can foist that on your reading of Hegel. I absolutely understand that. I don't want to be misunderstood about it. So it's I don't want to say, well, it's stupid and naive to read Hegel that way. I get why people read Hegel that way. I'm not accusing you of that. But where is that in Hegel? Where is he saying, when he ought to be saying that, he doesn't say that. He does not say an individuality that comes back to itself. Why? Because universality trumps particularity. And it subsumes it under. If anything, the subsumption model is constantly being shown to be inadequate. So this whole thing about difference is assumed under identity, I mean, come on. We've at least got to think it beyond subsumption. At least that. To be faithful, I think, to what Hegel's trying to force us. I think at least modicum of charity in the reading requires that. Beyond that, I really don't have a very good answer because it comes up to this point of I don't know the principle of exhaustion. I remember I had a friend that said to me one time, how do you know when it's done? He was talking about something different, but it applies here. How do you know when it's done? And, sort of like you're baking the cake, it's done when it reached the right temperature and, all that kind of stuff. You know when it's done because it's met the conditions. But what are the conditions of its exhaustion? I don't know what they are. I just know that it has to fully differentiate itself. And whatever the fully of its differentiation is, it's principle because it's negation. It's not just willy-nilly happening this way, that way. It has generation of itself, but we don't know when it's done with that process. And I think that's Hegel saying differentiation is that fundamental. We can leave it at that. Is that useful at all? Or
No, it is. No, it's really.
Did you have thoughts back about that?
I guess what I'm thinking now is maybe this is my preponderance to swing to the other direction where it's like, oh, well, no, there's no possibility that can't be. Now I'm wondering if it's the concept could never fully, in the total exhaustive sense, that what it is for the concept to work the way it is to continually, approximate some sort of infinite. I'm imagining the idea of an asymptote.
Yeah.
Perpetually.
Yeah, but see, then we get it. So notice where we both end up at that point, right? If we were to go down that route, we turn the concept into a spurious infinity, right? And another, and another, and another, and another, without never knowing when it circles back around. So that's true infinity, right? When it circles back around to itself. He clearly says individuality is where the moment returns to itself. So this moment of returning to itself, that's the moment of completion. No doubt about that. That's the moment of exhaustion. Absolutely the case. But the returning back to itself doesn't mean subsumed under the universality. It means universality come to complete and full determination. That's the mark of the moment of it turning back to itself. That's its way of thinking. That's his way of thinking circularity. And I confess that I don't know anything more than when it comes back to itself as being the answer to that. But that seems vacuous. Yes.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it turns into a spurious infinity. That's, who's first? I'm sorry.
Oh, you can go first.
Is there such thing at the level of the judgment conceptual differentiation that isn't already complete? Is it being fully exhausted an additional, if we're talking about universality particularizing itself, is there a way in which that could not be fully exhausted? It seems like that success condition is a vacuous success condition because it's particularizing is
it couldn't
positive.
not happen. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, I'm worried that I'm worried that we're making the completion of it an additional criterion rather than just being what the particularization is.
Yeah, but I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt.
No, keep going.
So, I think if we don't go the additional step of it has this completion moment, then we're stuck in the judgments of necessity, and we're stuck in we'll never make it to the judgment. We'll never make it to syllogism of necessity, because all of them are predicated on an exhaustion of universality and particularization. Without that, particularly most obviously in the disjunctive syllogism, you can't do the disjunctive syllogism without the universality being exhausted in its particularization. Because if it isn't exhausted, then the inference doesn't work. So that's a prerequisite for that syllogistic form to operate. So I think the culmination, the completion condition is not antecedent to that, it's part and parcel of that. So it's what's going on in the difference between the judgment forms now. The judgment form of necessity and the judgment form of the concept.
Okay.
Right? What's the difference between the disjunctive judgment, which you could say was just one damn thing after another. Right? It's just this and this, or it could be this, or it could be that, or it could be this. But, so that's a kind of interminable one thing after another, which is kind of spurious infinity. But what the apodictic judgment does beyond that is say, no, this is actually, I'm going to put my terms in here, the completion condition of universality itself. Is that this can't just be willy-nilly, arbitrary, empirical differentiation. It's got to be the determinations of the concept, determination of universality, that's exhaustive of it. Sorry. Exhaustively determining of it. I want to be careful about this language of exhaustion. I'm using it, right? So I'm guilty. And Hegel does use it on occasion. But it can sound like exhaustion means there's all this stuff welled up in universality. It's all got to be put out. Right? It's all buried within universality. It's all waiting to flow out and be, realized in some kind of way. I do not think that's the way Hegel thinks of exhaustion. He thinks of exhaustion as determination that's not already within universality itself. It is the determination, because it doesn't hold these things into itself. That'd be a version of the class concept of universality again, right? So it doesn't bear all this stuff within itself. It actually is differentiating itself, othering itself, and in that othering becomes determined by virtue of the differentiation itself. So that exhaustion is not, when we get finished with all the stuff I got buried within, unpacking all of that. So it's not an analytical exhaustion. It's a synthetic exhaustion.
Okay.
It's my attempt to try to differentiate. Fichte talks about an analytic exhaustion. He's very clear about this. Fichte says, the way you know you're done with the system is after you've unpacked everything that was included in, buried in the first principle. Because how do you know when you're done with it? Because you derive everything from it. This is in the Wissenschaft later. You derive everything from it, and then when you reach the end, you know you've reached the end because you go back to the beginning. It's the only thing you can infer. You go back to the I equals I, the A equals A. You go back to the first principle. That's when you know we've exhausted, we've unpacked everything analytically, we've unpacked everything that was in the first principle. That's not what Hegel's talking about with universality. It's not stuff that's buried, packed in analytically within the universality. That's what I think he's saying when he says universality just is particularization. It is its othering, it is its differentiation. Is that?
But then I'm worried then on the application of this to examples, like we say the roses. I say there's the shopkeeper sort of differentiation of the roses, and then there's the conceptual maybe joint carving that could be problematic. Yeah. But either way, we of course we're in the logic. We haven't earned the things to fill into the blanks here, other than the blanks themselves.
Right. The positionality.
Yes. And
that's why the species are all
the exhaustion of them, I guess, shouldn't be anything like that. Should be something that arises when you get there in the system. So it shouldn't be happening right now in the universality chapter, except for the vacuous case of whenever it applies to just the blanks themselves.
Yeah. But that does mean that there's an exhaustion of specification.
Yeah, okay.
Right? And there's a principled means for that exhaustion. I think all that's entailed by it. Yes? That's what determination does.
Yeah.
Let's just be clear, there's issues here. There's tons of issues here, for all sorts of reasons, some of which you're bringing up. Let me just add to the plate of problems here. It's one in nature. Didn't we learn from Darwin that species are not exhaustions, right? That's what natural selection is constantly doing, is proliferating empirically, right? But new species are being created. That's what natural selection does. And it's willy-nilly, right? So if you look at that, you say, well, Hegel's demanding that genus specify itself exhaustively in a principled way, and then you say, well, what's the model by which things have actually developed in the empirical world? And the best science we have about that is evolution, which says you develop species differentiation by virtue of natural selection, which is adaptation to circumstances that is willy-nilly. There's a bunch of different differentiations that happen, but only some get selected, right? Why do they get selected? Because of reproducibility. Right? They favor the reproduction of that particular species. They can survive, but not them personally, but the species can survive. The other species didn't survive. Well, that seems like an example of disorderly empirical differentiation without any kind of conclusion, right? Because Darwinian natural selection is a really great example of a spurious infinity. Add this, and this, and this, and this. Because it's constantly ongoing. So they're not working at the same level. I want to be very, very clear about that, right? Darwin's a natural scientist working at the level of empirical science. His results and his theoretical comprehension of those results is rooted in empirical observation and testing and scientific methodology. Hegel's working at the ontological level. But Hegel would want to say to that theory that where it leaves open the possibility of differentiation, that's got to be a principled differentiation, not merely a natural selection phenomenon. I do think that's right. So they are at odds about it. Is that an example?
I keep pushing off what she's checking
Yeah.
out.
Sorry. You go.
So I also have a very, I don't have the vocabulary to like express what I don't understand, but I don't understand the level. Like the example that you gave, humanity is either animal or vegetable.
Yeah.
To me, kind of sounds like the moment you say humanity, it stops right there because the word has been produced already from that distinction. So there seems to be something like behind that the sentence too. So to
Something
me,
behind that.
I'm going very quick, but so in the judgments, you were talking about how like there is like the is in the judgment already kind of there's a whole process like undergirding that and that the sentence builds.
Yeah.
I understand that, and also in the judgment you say like, oh, for example, the subsumption relationship, whatever, like talk in that term also.
Yeah.
So it fits into language and making statements very easily.
Yes.
Judgment forms.
Yeah.
But then now we're saying that the syllogism is different because it's not really like bound by the judgment, I guess. I'm not really understanding that part, like we're more objective or something.
No,
but then we're still saying it in terms of language, and we're still making these statements in the same exact manner, like this, even though it's supposed to be like some other thing that's happening. And also another thing that maybe helps you understand what I'm confused about is in the encyclopedia, we gave a presentation on this, and the like the syllogism of being, cognition, and philosophy.
Yeah.
I'm a little, because that one makes so much more sense. The examples there and how the different parts of the encyclopedia are connected according to this disjunctive syllogism.
Yeah.
To me, that makes so much more sense than the example you gave.
Yes.
Because those ones are already kind of like circled in themselves.
Right.
So that kind of like intuitively at least like I can't describe how it makes sense. But the word humanity and the word animal and the word vegetable, those are not like circled or anything.
Right.
So they don't have their own. We can't really see the process. Also, it's made in the form of the same words and the same type of stating as the judgment. So I'm sure is that why the example is too simplistic for us to understand, or like is that where like the kind of like when you look at this, it does look too simple, and it's almost like should be phrasing it in a different way. That was kind of my confusion there.
Yeah. So let me pick out two. You said a lot of things there. Let me try to pick out two, and if you want to come back with other things, let's absolutely do that. Let me pick out two to respond to. And so let me just pick out two. So one of the things you said is that the judgment forms work really well for you as an account of what goes on linguistically, what we do in language. I agree. And then you said the syllogistic forms go beyond that and seem to not accord with what we do merely in language. I want to challenge that bit because the judgment forms are about predication, which we do in language all the time. So the judgment forms work for that. Right? Makes a lot of sense. And, we don't always think about, well, it has to be a concrete universal that's doing this, right? So we're not talking about our apodictic form. We don't talk about it in those terms, but you can make the judgment form SSP predication work and then realize, oh, wait a minute, that predication is really working because of other logical operations that are going on within it, which is what you see in the apodictic judgment. Sorry, what you see in the disjunctive and the hypothetical judgment, but then you finally see it in the apodictic judgment how that works. So all that I would put around the idea of the judgment forms work linguistically. I was articulating linguistic practices. I absolutely agree. The one I'm worried about and one I want to challenge is the claim that inference is not linguistic. I do think this is the way we think. I do think we think inferentially. I actually think, if you by what Hegel's doing here, that the truth of concepts of judgment, the truth of judgments of syllogism, then syllogism is the more fundamental form than judgment. I think judgments are abstractions from inference, and concepts are abstractions from judgment. I mean, that's the way the embeddedness of one and the other actually works. And so I don't think it's right to say that predication is linguistic and inference is not linguistic.
So that wasn't what I was trying to say.
Oh, I'm sorry, I misunderstood.
I was trying to say that in the judgments, it's almost like we have this one sentence and it's got different semantic layers.
Yeah.
And different, like, like whatever example we give, we can extract those different layers and form those into those judgments.
Okay.
It all kind of, you kind of have to go through it, like you kind of have to go through each layer to kind of figure out, like it's not like a given almost, like you have to look at the sentence and figure out those different layers. But this one, there seems to be a presupposition, like in the example that you have, such that I don't really feel the need to go through, like I can technically, like if someone puts a gun on my head, I can do this thing
Yeah,
myself.
but why would you?
But yeah, I don't really understand like the humanities. I said humanities done. Like I don't really understand why I'm supposed to be going through this. I don't really think Hegel's wrong here. Like I feel like the syllogism of being cognition philosophy is very, like, for me, it's always been very, very complicated, but kind of like there's a truth to it, I think.
Yeah.
But this example doesn't seem to me like it's doing that challenge. It's not challenging me in the right. It seems like I'm down with the word humanity. Like there's a semantic, because in the judgment there's a semantic interest. In this one, semantically, I
It's not
think
interesting.
that's why it's so simple.
Yeah.
Like to me, it sounds like, why is this so simple?
The
Why is it
conclusion's
reducing-
obvious.
It's reducing the complexity of it.
I get it.
In my opinion, that's why I'm like, am I understanding this wrong or?
No. So let me say back to that then. I appreciate you clarifying that. Let me say back to that then, that don't hinge everything on my stupid example. Number one, never. Hinge everything on my stupid example. What I am trying to do is show the basic, rudimentary, elementary operation of a disjunctive syllogism in terms of proliferation of various different categories, the elimination of some categories, therefore the inference of the other categories being true, or the disallowing the other categories, therefore the first category must be true. It's that basic kind of inference. The only way that works is if the universality does exhaustively differentiate itself into all these other categories, all these other species. That's really what's trying to be shown. And I agree with you, in some cases, maybe this one is a prime example of that, you don't really need to run through all the others. You don't need to have them eliminated. It just is what it is. It's manifestly, self-evidently the case. So, true.
So that's why we don't need to say these. Like, I guess there's not the same need as judgments. Like,
Well, I don't know if there's that need in judgment, right? Think about, this is the interesting thing about the analysis of apodictic judgment, right? X is necessarily Y. Part of the analysis of that as an apodictic judgment is it's just true on the face of it, right? You don't need any reasoning to have that to be self-evidently true. That's what apodicticity means there. It's just, and I didn't emphasize this, it's my fault there, I'm sorry. That it's just self-evidently the case. That X is of course Y, like you have here in the conclusion of disjunctive syllogism. Of course that's the case. But Hegel's point about the apodictic judgment is, actually that's not self-evidently the case. It's self-evidently the case, but it's self-evidently the case because buried underneath it is a set of reasoning that allows you to have this as its conclusion. And so it's mediated, not self-evident. That's no surprise, that's Hegel. Here, what was buried in the apodictic judgment is rendered explicit. Doesn't mean it's complex and interesting every time, but it means that it's always operative there, even when the conclusion may be self-evidently the case. That's the first thing I would say about it, but don't worry about my particular example, it's stupid. Now we go to the, you mentioned that Hegel does, in my view, appeal to the disjunctive syllogism at the end of this, at the end of the encyclopedia, to talk about the relationship between logic, nature, and spirit, the three parts of the system. I think he absolutely does that. He treats the logic as universality. He treats nature as particularity. He treats spirit as singularity or individuality. And you can see very clearly working through three different kinds of syllogistic endings, right? Syllogisms are concluding, schließen, to conclude, to complete, to bring together. So he's invoking that you end the system with what? Syllogisms, right? And the final syllogism is a disjunctive syllogism. And there, the logic is universality that proliferates itself into, exhaustively, nature and spirit. So if you're talking about one, you must infer the other. If you're talking about the other two, you must be talking about the first. So all those relationships work at that point because they're predicated. Now, that's a useful illustration of this basic syllogistic form only if you have some sense of what logic, nature, and spirit mean in the Hegelian system. It falls on deaf ears if you don't have any sense of what that means. Right? That's the point about it. So it can be a great illustration, but it also cannot be. I prefer to use here this kind of illustration because I wanted to keep it as simple, maybe too simple, as possible. Is that useful? That's the reason for the stupidity of the example.
I don't know. It's okay though.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
Other comments? Where are we at for the time on it? So oh, sure. Ron.
I think you kind of addressed this with other people's questions.
Sure.
But I'm still sort of struggling with it.
Let's do it.
If part of the function of the disjunctive syllogism is you sort of have this list of exhaustive universalities, and you sort of say, well, it's not these handful. I'm still struggling with like how you know, and you sort of said this earlier, but like how you know when you've been exhausted.
Yeah.
Like, this makes me think of like negative theology.
Yeah.
Where you sort of you look and say, okay, this is not God, this is not God, this is not God.
Right.
But my understanding of the point of negative theology was that you're really never going to get there.
Right.
It sounds like a bad infinity to me.
Yeah.
I'm struggling with why this is not a bad infinity.
I think that's a fantastic example as a contrast, right? So let me try to make the case that it's a contrast. Because you would have said, well, it sounds like the same thing to me, and I get that. In the forgetting what the negative theology is terms for. Okay, sorry. Epiphansis, right? So epiphantic tradition, you say, well, God is not this, God is not that, God is not this. Always buried in those declarations is that God is something beyond all that. That there is God. That God is over and above all these things that God is not. So you can't know God directly, negative theology's fundamental claim. But what you can know is that God is not. So you can know God by roughly inference from contrast. Right? God is not all these other things. So God's not all these other things, that God is the God beyond being, to use the Platonic formulation of it, right? So that's where you can go with something like that, whatever the hell that means. But that's that. But that means, and I'm going to start using loaded terms here, so I apologize for this. Negative theologians hate what I'm about to say, let's be clear. That God is a plenitude beyond every kind of finite determination. That God is over and above. That's what it really is. That God is so superabundant. I remember Jean-Luc Marion said at a conference one time that the point of the ontological argument, Anselm's ontological argument, he also talked about Descartes, but because he's a brilliant Descartes scholar as well. But he's talking about Anselm. He said the point of Anselm's argument was not to prove the existence of God. And I'm sitting there going, sorry, nothing greater than God. I thought that's what the whole point of that argument. No, he said the point of that argument is to establish that God is beyond existence. And the real point of the argument is to show that God, this is no surprise to those who've read Marion's work, that God is love. And if you look at Anselm, that's actually where he goes, right? That God is beyond. Because God is a super plentiful, abundant love that's beyond any determination. That's the way the negative theological, so he reads it, Marion reads the ontological argument as a kind of version of negative theology, right? It's determining that from which nothing greater can be thought. Well, God's that, but God's beyond. So that's not God. So here's the contrast. When Hegel says universality is nothing other than its particularizations, he's not saying it's not this, not this, not that, not this. And there's a plenitude of universality concept. It's over and above, different than, separate from, whatever the language we're going to use for it is, over and above these determinations. He's saying it just is those determinations. The problem here is, as you rightly said at the beginning, is that we don't know when that's fully exhaustively done. But we're not saying, well, there's more to it, there's more to it, there's more, because there's more to God. There's more to the concept. We're just saying all those differentiations, we don't know if it's done. But that is all there is to the concept. The concept is nothing over and above those differentiations. So I know we love to say that, this goes to other matters as well, so let me just at least draw one of those matters out. I know we love to say that Guy, spirit, is, God in disguise or whatever, the famous lines about, this is how Hegel sneaks Christianity back into philosophy after it being, thrown out by whomever. Hegel's saying, well, actually, God's nothing other than the determinations that God issues forth. He's not a very good Trinitarian. I mean, he is and he isn't, right? Because, good Trinitarians know that God the Father exists and has God the Son and then God the Holy Spirit. And Hegel will say, that's a nice pictorial way of representing a fundamental ontological truth. And that fundamental ontological truth, which doesn't really comport with the story terribly well, is that God is, the concept is, nothing other than its particularization, incarnation, its death, and its othering of itself in that death. Its ongoingness, which we call spirit in the Trinity formulations. But, those aren't three separate persons, right? That's terrible Trinitarian theology. So at that point, right, is he thinking about something that's a plenitude over and above this stuff? I don't think so. And that's where I would draw the contrast with the negative theology. Does that
Yeah, it does make sense.
Does that make some sense? I think that's an excellent way of thinking about this issue. I don't know if I've been down that road sufficiently to think through all the permutations of that. But that's the first place I would go to. Right? Is that if God is beyond being, if that means that God is super abundant beyond. I mean, this is Derrida's take on negative theology as well, by the way, right? That Derrida's take on this stuff. This is where it goes with this. Some of this is in response to Mark Ellen's, but so this is what it is. It's really a superabundance that above any determination. I think Hegel says there is nothing above determination. There's nothing. This goes back to something I was saying earlier. There's nothing laying in wait to be determined, to be made explicit, to be brought out. And this is why we'll come back to this when we look at life. But I think an Aristotelianized version of Hegel is ultimately wrong. That it's not everything's waiting in potentia to become actual. Right? So waiting in the concept, laying there, directing its own course to culmination and then fruition. I don't think that's the case. I don't think Hegel allows you that for the reasons we've already commented. I'm sorry, it was a long-winded answer to
No,
a very good question. Other comments? I kept us over? No, we're still good. Easily keep us over. Yep.
On the Darwin thing, I'm wondering why. So yes,
I knew this would get me in trouble.
yeah. So
Okay.
I mean, it seems, yes, like that's a glaring issue. There's tons of scholarship about how to make, because Hegel denies. I mean, there's his pre-Darwin, but
Yeah.
he's denying the forms of evolution
Yeah,
at the
relative-
conceptual level, rightly. But reckoning with Darwin here. Okay, so yes, that's a spurious infinity of sorts, but why does that get, like, I don't see how that's a problem, because you can't just stick with spurious, like, spurious infinity goes somewhere. Like, spurious infinity can't just be, like, any of the categories can't just be
What?
yeah.
Couldn't you say this? That this is maybe a cheap reconciliation. So please, brand it as cheap if you think, oh, that's ridiculous, right? If it's insightful, good, maybe not. But Darwin is ultimately working within the confines of natural science. And one of the confines of natural science is you can't know principle of exhaustion. There are no principles of exhaustion within natural science. That would be anti-scientific. To say, oh, it's reached, it's done. Right? The permutations are over. Right? There's no more possible. Right? Well, look at the fossil record. Right? You've got a lot of reasons to think otherwise already. So at the natural scientific level, all you can ever get is disjunction without principle totalization. You can get totalities, but they'd be relative empirical totalities, and that's the best you can have. But that's the confines, right? That's the constrictions of a natural science. I don't mean that disparagingly. It's just the confines of a commitment to natural scientific methodology. What the speculative method allows you that the natural method perhaps doesn't is a claim about there would be a principled exhaustion, even if empirically we never get there. Because that's a matter of discovery and knowledge. But at the ontological level, we could say, well, it does close off. It has to eventually come back to itself. What that is, where that is, we can't predict. We don't know it, none of that kind of stuff. But we can know that full determination of the concept, full individuality of the concept would eventually have to be the case. But because of necessity of determination. But what that is, when that is, we don't know that. So that's the limitations of space-time.
I don't see those things as having to be as, or maybe I'm misunderstanding the way in which you're drawing a distinction
Okay.
between those, because I mean, sure, there's a spurious inexhaustibility of speciation. I don't know,
Speciation, yeah.
speciation
That's the way to talk
in
about it.
Darwin.
Yeah.
But at the same time,
Proliferation of different
we
species.
have taxonomies, and those taxonomies are showing them as exhausted. And I know that there's maybe a non-scientific components to that.
Yeah.
You look at if Hegel thinks that nature entails spirits, and there's a way in which you're not going to any new Darwinian species that were to occur off of humans, for example, if that were to be a thing, if two populations of humans were to create two different species,
Yeah.
that wouldn't be very meaningful at a conceptual level.
Yeah.
So
It's a difference. It doesn't make a
but
difference.
the principle of exhaustion there just is it's not stuck at the level of Darwin, I suppose. I guess
What
I
I
don't
would
think
say
it-
is that there's relative totalities. That's why you can do taxonomy.
Mhm.
You can do relative totalities there, relative proliferation of species, and say this species has played itself out. But the proviso is always as far as we know, because that every science has to natural science has to operate with that proviso. As far as the observation, as far as the data tell us thus far, here's as far as we can go. And anything other than that, if you start saying things more than that, then welcome to speculative metaphysics. And I'm glad to have you, but let's at least acknowledge that that's what you're doing at that point. You're not doing natural science anymore, right? You're doing something called Naturphilosophie. Good, but not the same thing. But then you're working with a principle of totalization that, to go back to the questions, right? What is the principle of that totalization? It can't be empirical exhaustion. Here's all the record, and here's it's done. Here's all the permutations that we can find, and they all seem to be played out. These something like this, these can't survive for these sorts of reasons, so that proliferation won't happen anymore. That seems to me to be the way you draw the distinction between an empirical totality and a speculative conceptual totalization. That's what I'm trying to do.
if we were to use a different example other than species, or we could go to space and time.
Yeah.
We were talking at the break,
Yeah.
and how space proves to be time,
Yeah.
and then vice versa.
Yeah.
And Holgate makes a point that, and this is in the time proving to be space thing, that it's
Yeah.
not that time temporally proves to be space, that it's not that after time is there, then
Then you get space.
position, or that the categories that occur in philosophy of nature are not temporally
Right.
ordered.
It's not the unfolding of creation.
Yes, which I can get behind at some level, but I think that this gets to the exhaustibility criteria thing again, is
Okay.
where else are the categories coming from, if not from, say, with time, temporalizing? Like, it's not that the conceptual thing that's happening, or that the conceptual description of temporality in the philosophy of nature is something that applies to some object out there, time.
Right.
And that's something that's strange about Hegel's philosophy of nature, is that space is externalization of the
Yes.
idea, and in that negativity. So there's a way in which these categories are temporally done. So if we that's controversial in the literature, but then if we take that to the species example, the Darwinian speciation stuff is the level at which speculative metaphysics emerges out of that. It's not a jump that occurs that you have to add something. I guess I'm just worried of that. I know you're not directly saying that would break immanence and whatnot,
Yeah.
but I'm worried of that being an idea, that it's like you can actually faithfully stick to just Darwinian speciation without actually and take that seriously without showing how that proves to be something more.
I think so. And this will be the last thing we do. So, I think as a scientist, you're committed to the spuriousness of that infinity.
Okay.
So the openness of every taxonomy that you can create. principled commitment to that because of the scientific method itself. If we don't have data, if we don't have experimentation that establishes the results that go towards proving those claims, then we have no reason to go down that road. And that's okay. Right? We don't have to have exhaustibility of our knowledge in that way. And the taxonomies are relative total particularities, we're good. We're fine. That's all we need for, we don't need more. It's when you step into the mode of, well, these are closed, that you've then left behind, in my view, natural science and started making speculative metaphysical claims. And I want to know what's the justification for those. Just as a metaphysician, I'd like to know what's the argument for that claim, other than the assertion of, well, that we're done. That's dogmatic assertion I've ever heard of, right? So I want to know what's the argument. And I don't think it'd be a natural scientific argument. It has to be a conceptual argument. Okay. So that's where I would go with that.
Okay.
We'll come back and talk
Yeah.
about it more. Others okay? All right. So next week, let me assign you this to deal with. Yeah, this is good. We're going to start on page 624, or I'll get us there. On page 624, where we left off today, right? We stopped on 623. We're going to start on 624. This is page 125 to 126 of the journal. And we're going to have to see how in those 1, 2, 3 paragraphs, Hegel makes the transition from subjective concept, judgment, syllogism, to objectivity. Because as you can see at the bottom of the page, this being is therefore a fact, which is in and for itself, objectivity. So he thinks that the disjunctive syllogism, because of what it is, entails the movement out of the formal concept into the real concept as a concept, to objectivity. So we all of a sudden get back to, not all of a sudden maybe, but we entail being. That's kind of crazy, right? We've been talking about the form of the process, and now we're going to be talking about the process itself, and we necessarily do that. Now his claim, just to give you a little something to go with, is that in this disjunctive syllogism, the form and the matter, the form of what it's talking about and the matter of the process of what it's talking about, collapses because you exhaust what is, you completely fulfill what the middle term could be. And so then it can no longer be just a form, it's got to actually be the content itself. Now, how does that argument work? What does it mean? We'll talk about that at the beginning of next week, and then we'll look at mechanism and chemism. And please, if you find the ending of chemism trauma-inducing, stop reading it, and we'll work on it some more past next week, right? I guarantee. Right? But it's crazy. There's 3 different syllogisms there. It's hard to keep track of them all. I can't remember them most of the time, and I read it all the time. So we'll work on it. All right. Good enough. Thanks.
On your last comment there, the thing that I'm struggling with on the difference between scientist and speculative metaphysician, and
Yeah.
obviously there's an appearance of, there's a difference there. Does the speculative metaphysician not themselves have a principal commitment to spurious infinity once they've derived, so we've imminently derived it, we've arrived at spurious infinity.
There's a commitment to it.
There's a commitment to it.
I absolutely agree with that. But that's not the ultimate truth of itself.
Yeah.
The ultimate truth is infinitizing truth.
But we don't know that at the level of once we're at spurious infinity, we are obstinately saying spurious infinity is the truth, and it nonetheless leads us to a
Yeah,
genuine.
but if you work through it conceptually, it entails truth
Yeah.
of itself.
Yes, of itself.
You don't need somebody to come in and say, well, look, you haven't considered these 4 or 5 other things.
Yes.
There's enough within spurious infinity to entail its own overcoming. If you'll let it, like that's usually the problem. You're saying, no, it has to be one more and one more and one more, and that's the only way it's going to work. But what if the one more and the one more is actually just infinitizing optically? It's the universality particularizing itself. And then it comes to conclusion in that way. But that's a speculative metaphysical claim, not a natural scientific.
So
I don't think it can be. Now, to
Yeah.
one other point, just to one other point.
Okay.
There's a lot, in my view, there's a lot of natural scientists, in particular in physics, theoretical physics in particular, who are doing speculative metaphysics.
Yes.
Because they hold a nominal commitment to experimentation and testability and verifiability, but it's nominal.
Yeah.
The thought experiments drive more. I mean, look at Einstein.
Yeah.
The thought experiments were more important than the actual. The experimental verification was incredibly important.
Yes.
Right? And Einstein was incredibly invested in, if this eclipse happened, will the sunlight bend around this
Yes.
and prove that space-time is actually what's doing this, not gravity. He's all committed to that. But he came up with this stuff out of no experimentation whatsoever. Right? It's all real, I mean, it's calculations through mathematics. There's a geometry that has to be brought in to think about
Yeah.
this, but it's all thought experiments he's trying to do.
Yeah.
At least as far as I can.
It's very conceptual.
Right.
Yeah.
So at that point, you're doing speculative metaphysics, in my view,
Yes.
with a tacit commitment to verifiability at the empirical level. But that's not. That's too much.
No, that's good. I guess I'm wondering, the phenomenological is too loaded of a term, but when the physicist or the metaphysician is there and they've arrived at some spurious infinity, what is happening when they either decide to conceptually progress it onto something else or continue on spuriously infinitizing? Like, it seems like, because I'm skeptical of the systematic contingency reading of how things happen in logic, but if there's a place that's most naturally read, to me, it seems like it's there, because you could keep choosing to go spurious infinity, or you could.
Why do you have to, of necessity, go to true infinity?
And if we want to deny the systematic contingency reading, how do we not get spurious? How do we choose, or forced to choose otherwise from spurious infinity?
So I think that's where, like, Burbage's reading of the transitions, I'm not talking about any particular reading he's making, just in general, that approach leaves open this idea that, well, you could have gone this way, you could have gone that way. And I don't think that's true.
Yeah,
I think
I'm skeptical of that.
Right?
Yeah.
That you could go one way or the other. I think the recalibration, the re-editing of the system is not evidence of contingency. I think it's evidence of Hegel trying to get it right. And he thinks, oh, here's where the necessary entailments actually are. They're not there. I was wrong. Right? And so I don't take it to be optional. Right? This is what Burbage reads it as. You could have gone this way, you could have gone the other way. But I think it's really, no, I think that way of doing this was wrong. And this is the right way. I'm trying to correct and revise for exactly those reasons. So this is where you can't stay with contingency. Sorry, you can't stay with spurious infinity. Spurious infinity necessarily entails, you can resist this necessary entailment, but the necessary entailment, if you'll
At the level of spurious infinity itself.
yes,
Yeah.
at the conceptual level of spurious
Got
infinity
it.
itself, necessitates its own undermining.
Okay.
That's
That makes a lot of sense.
that's what I think.
Okay.
Right? But you can stay caught up in it all you want. You can fall. This is like the same thing at the loss of the concept, right? You can separate universality, particularity, and singularity and go through subsumption all the rest of your life. You're good. You're living at the level of the understanding, and the understanding has got ontological roots. It's not false to reality.
Yeah.
But it's also not the truth of reality either. So you're fixated on dimensions of reality, but are not ultimately the fundamental truth of it.
And that's because the logic isn't a subject thinking the objects of the logic. It's an immanent procedure.
Does that help?
Yeah, that helps.
Yeah.
That does.
Excellent questions. Thanks.